welcome to episode 21 of the David Bernard Podcast. I'm joined today by Fox 8 meteorologist Nicondra Norwood. It's December 1st, Nicondra, and we put a wrap on the hurricane season yesterday. There's so much we can say about this season, but obviously it's Ida is the focal point. Months later, many residents of southeast Louisiana don't have their lives back together. Or in some cases, a clear picture of what their life is going to be like after Ida. We just did a story, I believe, yesterday. There's hundreds of people in Terrebonne Parish that are still waiting on trailers.
Yeah, and it's always, we talk about the benchmark storms, and we know that this is going to be one of those that kind of generational storms that people talk about for a long time and life changing.
It's just incredible, the impacts, and really the full impacts from them have yet to be seen. Like many storms, sometimes you have to get not only a year but years down the road to see what kind of permanent changes, both environmentally and also from a lifestyle standpoint, the hurricane will have. And certainly the coastal communities and those fishing communities, that's where the hardest hit areas have been.
And this is definitely one of those storms that it really exhibited some of the things that we've been talking about for the last 10 to 20 years about how these hurricanes are going to be making a bigger and bigger impact. And you really saw it with Ida.
Well, we've produced several podcasts already on Ida from both the human impact, but also the scientific research associated with it and why Ida became as intense as it did. There'll be more to come, but today we're going to take a broad look at the 2021 hurricane season and what made it so unusual. Every season there's something a little bit different. Now, obviously these last two seasons have in some ways been unprecedented because of the number of landfalls and the intensity. We're also going to talk about Claudette. Do you remember that storm?
I tell you, once you go through the whole season and we have all those ups and downs, and oh yeah, Claudette. It was so early on. It was so fast. I remember, we went from, oh, no storm to, oh, this might be a storm that we need to deal with. And literally by noonish, it was gone and beyond us. But it really made an impact for a lot of people.
It did. And in fact, we'll talk to Brian a little bit about it. That's going to be Brian McNoldy, who is our guest today. I first met Brian when I was in Miami, and I took notice of his papers on sea level rise in South Florida and the impacts it was having there. Brian's a senior research associate at the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. Being in Miami, he's all about hurricanes. And Brian has been writing a Tropical Atlantic Update blog in addition to that since 1996. And he's considerably younger than me. So he's started that at an early age. And just this week, he issued his summation of the 2021 hurricane season. And we'll use that to jumpstart our discussion. So let's bring in today's guest, Brian McNoldy. Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, David. Very happy to be here.
Well, first, why don't you start telling us a little bit more about your role at the University of Miami? I said in the introduction that you're a researcher.
Yeah, so basically, the official title is a senior research associate, but that more or less just means I work on the research part of the research groups that I'm in. I'm actually in three different groups, and so it kind of revolves around us doing grant-based projects. So we would have a grant that might last 3 years, and I have some amount of funding from that grant, and then usually a few other projects going on at the same time. Usually at least 6, it seems. And so it's just doing research, writing papers. I work with the grad students with their research. So yeah, it's just a kind of a research-based job, which entails sitting behind the computer all day.
And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what some of those projects are. Have you all been looking at the University of Miami at the current time, and maybe in the past year or two, if there's something you want to bring up? I kind of want to start with just a broad question, and it's an opinion, but I want yours. What surprised you most about the 2021 season?
Well, for sure, it had to be how it was just going full steam ahead and came to an abrupt halt. I think that blew everyone's minds. If you had asked pretty much anyone if we would go into the new extra alphabet, the extra list of names, I think everyone would have said yes. We were cruising through names like crazy, and then first week of October, that all came to an abrupt end, and there was just one more name storm about a month later. But yeah, to go from a screaming pace of naming storms to zero was just quite shocking.
And we'll get more
Well,
into that a little bit later on, but I think I'll agree with you on that, Nick.
yeah, I absolutely would have said, I was already thinking, I was like, boy, are we going to be retiring some of these new names already? And didn't happen. But, know, but those are the things that we look at and the things that we study. Now, you again also had another May storm. I think this was 7 years straight that we had a May
Yeah.
storm. So, with having so many storms and having those early storms, what do you think? How much of this has to do with the climate, the ocean temperatures, and how much of it has to do with, okay, how we're naming these storms and identifying these storms?
Yeah, that's a great question. This always comes up because, as you mentioned, we've now had named storms prior to the start of the official season for 7 years in a row. So that does start to raise some eyebrows. Um, and I would say there's probably three things going on at the same time as we look back through the record. Um, One is we may actually be treating storms differently. Like, maybe we are not we as in us speaking right now, but basically the hurricane specialist at the National Hurricane Center. Um, Perhaps over the last 10, 20 plus years, there's been a trend in what it takes to be a tropical storm or a subtropical storm. And not so much in the strict meaning of what it is, but just in how long it might last. I think maybe previously they were a little more slow to name things and wait to see if it lasts a little bit longer, which there's actually no time component of what it means to be a tropical or subtropical storm. So maybe we're doing it more correctly now. um, Part two, I guess, of what could be contributing to that is we can really detect things on a small scale pretty well now. That especially when you're just worried about crossing that wind threshold into becoming a named storm, a tropical or subtropical storm. Possibly, 15 years ago, we didn't have the tools to see that it was that intense, and it would have never gotten to that point, even though it may have been in the real world. Um, and then part three probably, I think, gets at what you mentioned in terms of a warming ocean and climate change. That if you're looking at somewhere in the Atlantic that, let's pick on 15 or 20 years ago again, some part of the Atlantic that was just a little too cold, a little not quite right for a tropical storm to develop. Maybe we just crept over that hump now, and it's just warm enough for something to form.
Well, so that's, I mean, people have, put out there, should the hurricane season start earlier? I mean, to me, I don't think it really matters so much. I mean, June 1st is a man-made created date, right? I mean, it's like, but it was based on observations and and climatology from what we knew that you really don't get anything until after June 1st. That's when the ocean temperatures are at least warm enough, across a substantial portion of the basin. So it's sort of an academic question more than anything else. And typically a May storm, the chances for significant impacts are minimal with many of these.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There really have not been hurricanes forming prior to June 1st. we've had some of these weaker named storms form. But as far as like hurricanes go, when you're talking about the actual hurricane season, there's no trend in the first hurricane formation date. So in that regard, it seems pretty safe.
Well, let's talk about the ways that we measure the hurricane season. So, this is another active, another above normal season. To me, there's basically three different ways that we can measure how active the season is, and we'll kind of go through each one here. The first one is just how many storms there were. We had 21 this year. How would you characterize that just based on the fact that we had 21 storms?
Yeah, if we don't look at anything else and just count up the number of named storms, it was extremely active. There's only been 2 other seasons that have ever had 21 plus named storms. In 2020, just a year ago, we blew past that mark. And then 2005 did it as well. So it's very rare to have that many named storms.
And
So,
no, go ahead, Nick.
oh, follow up, go ahead.
No follow-up. Keep going.
Okay, well, we were also talking about, we'll say numbers, but we also look at energy and ACE. So how would you categorize the season that way?
Yeah, so ACE is the accumulated cyclone energy, and it, rather than counting the number of storms, it actually accounts for how strong storms are and how long they last. So you could have one strong, long-lived hurricane with more ACE than 8 weaker storms combined. So in that regard, it doesn't care how many storms there are. So using ACE as the metric for the season, it was also well above average. It was about 140% or so, of average. So pretty well above. And it's actually the 6th season in a row with pretty well above average ACE, which that string of above averageness has never happened before.
Well, and so, okay, I'm going to back up. I am going to have a follow-up on the previous question, I guess. But so when we're talking about numbers of storms and also with ACE, I mean, number of storms kind of gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning, right? About the way we classify storms and the Hurricane Center. I won't say jumping the gun, but, there is no time and space component to naming a storm. If it's a storm, it's a storm. If it's gone in 6 hours, it's gone in 6 hours. And that's what we saw with a lot of these storms this year. So, we did have a large number of storms, 21, but, there were 7 hurricanes and 4 major hurricanes. And so 7 is the new climatological long-term average, how many you would expect, and 3 is how many majors we would expect, which is an increase from 2 over the previous 30-year normal range. And we had 4. So yes, that was above normal there, but it kind of seems, a little bit skewed. I guess when we talk about the ACE, like you said, it can be maybe a better indicator of how active the season is. There's also who did it impact? This was in your blog. 70% of the ACE this season was from 2 storms, Sam and Larry. 70% of it, and there were no impacts. I mean, I think Larry clipped Newfoundland or something like that, but I mean, that's like a breezy day for them. So that really, at least from a scientific standpoint, it was above average, but and believe me, we're going to talk about Ida here because, we're devastated down here. We did a story yesterday. Nick and I were talking about it here at the beginning that there's hundreds of people that still don't have adequate shelter. But, putting that aside, Ida, for the moment, is it still fair to say that this was a super active season if, for the most part, outside of one storm, a couple of storms, most of that ACE was produced over the ocean?
Yeah. So that actually gets at, I guess, method number 3 of how one might characterize a season. We can count storms, we can count hurricanes, we can count ACE, but we can also count the impacts. How much did the season cost in terms of both economy and human lives? And by that metric, it was also above average. It was the fourth most costly hurricane season on record. So, that's also pretty noteworthy. So by number of storms, by ACE, and by economic impact, it was well above the average.
And almost all of that, make it the fourth costliest. I mean, most of that was attributed to Ida.
Yeah.
Of course. I mean, because
Yeah.
of not only the impacts that we had here on the Gulf Coast, but just the incredible flooding that took place in the Northeast. Yeah, unbelievable. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the storms that impacted Louisiana in the Gulf Coast. Ida, we know, but Nick and I referred to this a little bit in the beginning about Claudette, and actually, I talked with my friend, Matthew Green at FEMA at the National Hurricane Center. We're good friends, and we are our own hurricane amnesia. We're halfway through the hurricane season, especially the ones when we're having these ones like 2020, 21. Somebody will bring up a storm that was 6 weeks before, and I have no clue as to what they're talking about. And so, Claudette to me kind of feels like the Cindy of 2005 for our area. I call Cindy the forgotten hurricane because obviously Katrina just overwhelmed everything. But Cindy caused the largest power outage in southeast Louisiana history since Hurricane Betsy in 1965. Okay. And there was incredible tree and damage all over the city of New Orleans, and Dennis came 6 days later, and everybody was panicked that we're not going to be able to get all this restored. And Dennis, of course, went east and hit the Panhandle. But afterwards, it was like, people were like, they upgraded Cindy to a Category 1, and everybody went, what was Cindy? So I had to go back and remind myself about Claudette. And one thing that was super unusual about Claudette is that it was actually named over land. Right. And so just discuss that process a little bit to the folks listening. Like, how's a storm named over land?
Yeah, it's certainly not your usual mechanism. So it already was getting its act together prior to reaching the coast. So it's not like it formed out of the blue over land, but it was an organizing storm that met the criteria officially, basically on the coastline. Now that's also that the Hurricane Center hasn't finished their postseason reanalysis yet, so it's possible that the first actual tropical point will be offshore somewhere. But as of now, since we're talking now, its first point as a tropical cyclone was basically on the coastline, and then it moved inland from there. But the thing is about South Louisiana and South Florida, for that matter, is they're very flat and very wet. So it's kind of what we call the brown ocean effect, where it's the storm is not technically over the ocean, but there's not too much of a difference between the ocean and flat, wet land.
And as a result, you can get a storm continuing to intensify. I remember Katrina when it was moving over Miami-Dade. And part of this was kind of the same thing. I mean, the storm sort of continued to strengthen on its way into the Gulf, and part of that was, it was moving over the Everglades, but it was also pulling in incredibly warm air from the Straits, from the Gulf, and still from the Atlantic. But I kind of think of Katrina in that sense that, as it traversed over the southern peninsula there, nothing really happened to it.
Wasn't much of a speed bump.
No. No. And so you have the same sort of thing going on in South Louisiana, except the only difference is as it moves inland, it doesn't find another ocean like you do when you cross Florida.
It was incredible with Claudette. I mean, that was in some ways like the worst storm for the Mississippi Gulf Coast this season. They had over a foot of rain. Areas around Bay St. Louis, these areas had incredible flooding. Slidell and southeastern St. Tammany Parish, and so it was a tropical storm, but it did have major impacts. And so we have Ida. We've done several podcasts about Ida over the last few months and its impacts. What stands out for you with Ida from a scientific perspective? It can be several things, but maybe what's the biggest takeaway from you that you found the most interesting?
Sure. It fits in with some of the others of this extremely rapid intensification, and then reaching peak intensity right at landfall. It's like the worst possible case. You have
Hmm.
it, one or the other of those is bad enough, but when you combine them, where you have a rapidly intensifying storm, so it made landfall only 3 days after it formed. So at that point, that's already not that much time, even if you knew exactly what the future
Hmm.
held. Let's say the forecast, the intensity of the track forecast was just absolutely perfect, and you knew that 3 days out. 3 days still is not that much time to evacuate things and prepare things. So it's just that, sometimes nature just throws these things that are virtually impossible to be ready for.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was going to say it just seems like we've been seeing that a lot lately in the Gulf Coast, and a lot of our viewers and people are looking at that forecast and saying, "Well, wait a minute. They're wanting this week and a half out to see, oh, this is a big monster storm, and we don't get that a lot."
Right, right. There's a map that I made a few years ago. Well, it would have been about 3 years ago, um, when Michael was upgraded to a Category 5 hurricane at landfall. So I guess that was actually later in the 2019 first part of the year when they finished the postseason stuff.
mhm.
Um, so Michael is the fourth Category 5 hurricane to hit the mainland U.S. And the fairly amazing stat about those four is all of them were tropical storms only 3 days before. So there was when the strongest storms end up hitting us, they come with minimal lead time, and it's possible that Ida is. I mean, it was very close to Category 5 status. It wasn't that far off. So again, we'll kind of see what the postseason
Hmm.
reanalysis holds, but
Yeah, and so yeah, the Cat 5. Just for the folks listening, the four, Michael, the one that you're mentioning, was the most recent Category 5 landfall in the United States, and then before that, Andrew, Camille, which we're also familiar with here, and Andrew, and the
Hmm.
1935 Labor Day storm in the Keys. South Florida and Southeast Louisiana, I always say our hurricane history are very tied together because a lot of
yeah,
times these monster storms, if they move through South Florida, they're coming here. Katrina and Andrew being just a couple of the most recent cases. So also with Ida, it was not just how fast it developed, but where that happened, and that was like I believe I'm trying to remember what is his on Twitter. I'm trying to remember him. He does a lot of the hurricane research, but he plotted that Ida was the furthest north to have such rapid intensification in the Gulf that had been
uh,
observed.
yeah.
I mean,
I vaguely remember that coming around. Yeah, it is because usually we have those extreme cases of rapid intensification in the deep tropics.
Hmm.
And by the time you're in the northern Gulf of Mexico, that's definitely not the deep tropics. So it
right,
was
and
pretty hot.
even Zeta kind of did that last year. I
Uh-huh.
mean, which was even more incredible, being in late October. Now the strongest hurricane on record to hit the United States so late in the season. So if the Gulf was able to do that in late October,
Hmm.
it kind of makes you wonder about things. And so let's talk a little bit more about this explosive development in the Gulf. And you've alluded to Michael. We have Harvey that occurred. We had Laura,
All right.
even Delta to some extent, and even Zeta. I don't know if Zeta did it officially rapidly intensify. I don't know if it met the definition of that. I can't
Hmm.
remember. But it was close. I mean, I want to say, is this a trend of seeing these storms more often, or is it maybe just a function of the warm cycle
Hmm.
we're in? I know we're the Gulf of Mexico has been near record warm levels over the last 10 or 15 years, it's seen some of its warmest readings that we have, and going back to, I guess, the early 80s, when we really have reliable data as far as that goes. Or is it just what happens in the Gulf, as you alluded to, with these other landfalling storms that were Category 5s?
Hmm.
Well, that's a tough question. As far as is it a trend or not? We certainly have seen a fairly uncomfortable number of hurricanes that rapidly intensify and reach their lifetime peak right at landfall. Like I said, that's like the worst
Hmm.
possible combination of things. Is it's quick and it gets really strong, and it's not intuitive. It's very, very much um, counterintuitive, actually. That you have this rapid intensification when it's closest to the coast, when some of the storm circulation is already over land, and it's still winding up and intensifying. And so, I mean, when a storm makes landfall, that means half the storm is already on land and half of it is over the ocean. And to have that be when it's at its strongest is really odd. But yeah, we've seen, as you said, quite a few notorious cases lately.
And Nick, before we get into the climate, the broad climate question that we have to throw
Hmm.
out to Brian, because we get asked it all the time. Um, what? In fact, you know what? Let's go to that. I may have lost my train of thought on what exactly I wanted to ask you on that.
Oh,
Yeah, let's go to climate right now, because I
Okay,
think
and then
just
I'm
the
going to come
idea we've
up
been
with it.
talking
I'm going to
about,
come up with it.
the numbers, the ACE, the rapid intensification. I know a little bit of it too is just more awareness and more knowledge that this is going on. People are a little bit more aware. But how much of it do you think is climate change related?
well, certainly some component. It's hard to put a number on it. Climate change is one of those things that it kind of just acts in the background. So we have all the, from one year to the next, even from one week to the next, there's a lot of changes that happen in the atmosphere. So, one hurricane season can be really active, the next one can be rather inactive. That doesn't mean that global warming has stopped or reversed just because you get an inactive season. There's a lot of noise in the natural system, so huge ups and downs. But superimposed on that is this gradual trend. So all that does is it can make some things maybe more or less likely than they would have been without it. Um, I think that's how I think of it. Really, is not that it's responsible for any storm or any active hurricane season, but it's a contributor.
Okay, now I remember where I wanted to go with this when we started talking about the Northern Gulf, and as far as the climate change question goes, because Nicondra and I get asked this all the time. It's like you said, it's complicated at best, and I don't think there's any definitive answer yet as far as the impact on tropical cyclones. I don't think we see that yet, but let's talk about ocean currents for a minute. We talked with some researchers at LSU last month when discussing Ida, and the loop current this year was displaced much farther to the north than it had been. And so that obviously had a huge amount to do with why Ida exploded the way it did. And of course, the loop current, I kind of think that came into the public's knowledge in 2005 when it was so prominent. We had Katrina, Rita, and Wilma passing over that. What has any of your research shown regarding the loop current, and is it becoming more of a permanent feature? Is it more enhanced? And maybe how does that play with, say, the Gulf Stream?
I'm not as well in tune with the loop current and the kind of the underlying oceanography of things. I mean, there certainly are people here who are much more in tune with it than I am. I do remember it being a kind of an outlier this year, that it kind of was. People were noticing that it didn't look normal. It was, like you said, it extended a lot further north than normal. So all that does is bring rather warm ocean temperatures even further toward the coast than they would have been.
Yeah, I just, I didn't know if, like, I mean, like the Gulf Stream, I mean, I know you've looked at that as far as it relates to sea level rise and things like that, and especially into South Florida. And then when you look at the current as it goes, between Bahamas and Florida, into the Straits, that's something I've been interested in. And we have somebody at LSU who that's what a lot of the podcast was talking about. That's her specialty. I just wonder how all those, interplay. But that's probably an area that is being looked at. I know that they're looking at that, and to see if the loop current in fact is something that's going to be more prominent or more permanent, in the future.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it does matter, certainly. And it's not a stationary thing in the course of months of hurricane season. It moves around. Sometimes it's bigger, sometimes it's smaller. So it's, and depending on when a storm happens to pass over it, or for how long it sits there.
Yeah. I'm going to get you out of this, Brian. I know, because the loop current is bad. That's what we've established here. We don't like the loop current.
We don't like it. Not our friend. But what we do like, and we want to talk about a little bit, is let's look back at the National Hurricane Center's track and intensity forecast for this year. What's your take on that? Do you have a postmortem from your view?
Yeah, I haven't run all the verification stats yet. Sometimes they also do it when they're done, but I can do it a little bit before, even if all the storms aren't completely in, because they don't normally change much in the postseason.
But like, what about Ida though? Let's talk just specifically about Ida.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess that's that in one sentence though. Quick, for the overall season, I think the track and intensity forecasts were quite good in a bulk sense. But zooming into Hurricane Ida, I'd say they were exceptional. Like, if every storm could be forecast that well, we'd be thrilled. It was the track was nailed almost immediately, and didn't wobble around really at all. And the intensity forecast was really remarkable, because right from the start, the very first advisory already had rapid intensification built into it, which is extremely unusual for them to do. I mean, it's very aggressive. You're forecasting an outlier, which, as anyone knows who's tried to forecast anything, you generally don't do that.
Well, and we started to get into that earlier, and I'm glad Nicondra kind of circled back around to it. So, right, on the first advisory for Ida, they forecasted a 110 mile per hour storm to be off the coast of southeast Louisiana. And as you mentioned, that track shifted 40 miles here, 30 miles, not much. And, the problem we have here with evacuations, especially for metropolitan New Orleans, is that we need at least 60 hours for the assisted evacuation, that is. And these storms are not providing that window. I mean, the only way it would have worked in Ida is if on that first advisory we looked at that and, like most emergency managers say, oh, it's 110. Well, we got to assume that's going to be a 3, right? And with our new levee system, though, we don't necessarily even evacuate for a 3 if it's going to be fast enough moving. Now, Ida turned out to be a slow-moving storm, but it was also smaller in size. It's interesting, these decisions that have to be made, and they're right on the edge, right, of these decision points. And Ida was certainly one of them. But that's an excellent point that you brought up, that original forecast being as strong as it was. But, I don't want to get you into the whole evacuation thing, but certainly, the messaging, that we in the media are involved with and carrying the Hurricane Center's message, I think that would be pretty dire. I mean, I know that was the tone that we were striking, that said, hey, look, we've got this forecast as a depression. In less than 72 hours, we could have a near major hurricane.
Yeah. And that's the tricky thing. So you don't know in advance. We have the advantage of hindsight now, but when the storm first formed and the models were all pretty aggressive with it, and pretty track wise consistent too.
Hmm.
Um, but that still doesn't, you don't know that that's going to be the answer.
Yeah.
You're
And evacuations are costly, and sometimes they're even more dangerous than the actual storm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, did we know right then that that was the trigger to pull? I mean, in hindsight, it worked out as far as the New Orleans area goes, not for the areas outside New
Hmm.
Orleans, but those areas were evacuated. All right. Well, the other thing that I noticed on your blog, which I've talked about over the years, I knew this fact, but folks listening may not. The most retired storm name letter.
Yeah.
It's
Uh,
always the eyes.
The eyes have it. Yes.
and so you know, is there any scientific reason behind why that's the case? It's by quite a bit. It's a bit odd. I mean, is it because just
Yeah.
climatologically, once you get to I, is more likely in most years to be in the peak of the season, producing the most intense storms?
Kind of, but that has issues too. I would say a decent fraction of it is just luck. That so many ice storms have just happened to be the hard hitting ones. So with this year included, I mean, there's no doubt at all that Ida will be retired. So we'll just count that. That's actually so that brings I's up to 12 retirees, um, and the ones behind that only have 9, and that's C and F storms. So that's where the peak of the season and the timing kind of doesn't work out because C and F are also they're pretty scattered.
Well,
And
but in a lower number season, your C comes in that same time range.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
how
it's
often do we get those these days?
Yeah.
I think the issue is we have a relatively short period where storms have been named. They started getting names in 1953, and it's relatively uncommon for storms to be retired. I think we're at 94 of them now. So when you're trying to fill out the shape of a bell curve, let's say, um, when you have too few points going into it, it's not a very well filled out curve, I guess is how I would look at it. So, you know, let's revisit this in another 100 or 150 years and see what the curve looks like and what letters winning then. But yes, for now, I has got it by a long shot.
All right, let's go now to what you said at the very beginning of today's podcast, which you thought was the most surprising aspect of the 2021 season, and I agree with it, is the incredible shutdown in the Atlantic. Basically, the hurricane season ended at the end of September. There was nothing after that. We had Wanda a few weeks ago that was out in the Northeast Atlantic and not
Yeah.
was not formed by purely tropical means, like more subtropical, like you would see a May storm develop. Do you have any idea? Have you spoken to any of your colleagues or even folks at the Hurricane Center that have any notion of why that was the case, especially in spite of what you were saying earlier, this being a La Nina, a fairly strong La Nina right now?
Yeah, I don't have any great answers to that, unfortunately. It was it was such an abrupt change, and the large scale environmental factors, like wind shear and sea surface temperature and all those usual suspects, they didn't all of a sudden become unfavorable. The large scale still looked okay. There were certainly times here and there where you might have had a higher shear pocket and this and that, but that's part of the normal noise. Um, what I seem to remember, and this is completely just my own recollection that maybe someone else can agree with or disagree with, but is that it seemed that we lost the the storm, I guess, what do I call them? Kind of the storm embryos. There were not a lot of things that we were looking at even. Like, oh, is this storm going to make it? Oh, no, it got wiped out by blank. We didn't even have those. There was like nothing to model. There was nothing to track. It just flatlined. Now, why that happened, I don't have an answer to yet.
And it was also, I went back to Dr. Phil Klotzbach's Twitter feed. It's globally. There's been no major hurricane across the globe since September 25th. The first, he says, in the satellite era that goes back to the 1960s. And as we know, for the West Pacific to not produce a major typhoon during that time period is pretty incredible. So I'm going to find you a grant to look into this, Brian. Okay. So, I mean, I just think it's sometimes, I said earlier, we were talking, I said, sometimes I think the things that don't happen are more interesting and extreme than what actually happens.
Yeah. I mean, if we knew the recipe that could shut down tropical cyclones around the world, that would be a game changer for the insurance market for sure.
I think they'd love that.
Yeah.
Well, we've been talking and all about our hurricanes and how this season has gone, and we need to know a little bit more about you, Brian. We always like to ask, why are meteorologists? What are weather geeks? How did you get into this kind of study?
Well, I mean, I guess I always was interested and loved staring out the window at storms for as long as I can remember as a little kid. But certainly, I remember being. So I grew up in the Northeast part of the country in Southeast Pennsylvania, and so we would get big snowstorms. We get nor'easters and things like that. And I remember a storm when I was pretty little yet that I wasn't allowed out in because the snow was higher than I was, and I'd get lost in it. So that's a few years ago. And then as far as hurricanes go, it really was 1985 was Hurricane Gloria, and that stayed offshore. As far as where I was in eastern Pennsylvania, the center didn't really come that close to us, but it was a big storm. And I was in school at the time, and that we had off of school for a hurricane, which was the first and only time that ever happened. As long as so it was certainly kind of an eye-catching thing. I'm like, what's this thing offshore here that's causing us to not have to go to school?
It's amazing how hurricanes are really like kind of the benchmark, that can lead us down this stuff. I mean, I had Hurricane Alicia in Houston in 1983. My first day of high school, hurricane watch. First day of high school, hurricane watch. Third day of high school, hurricane, and then no school for 10 days. So it's amazing how that comes together.
Runs those benchmarks.
So, all right. So we know. So Gloria got you, which is what I hear from a lot of my East Coast friends that are our contemporaries, let's say. And now you're down at the University of Miami and have been for quite some time, doing great work down there. And I lauded you in our introduction here. Brian gave me some good schooling on sea level rise while I was there. But let's talk about the future and hurricane research. Where do you see hurricane research going in the future? It can be related to storm intensity or any other aspect. And feel free to discuss the types of stuff you guys are looking at UM right now.
Sure. I think we still really have trouble with intensity forecasts. Track forecasts are really pretty good. And when you look at the trend over the last 5, 10, 15 years, it's almost starting to flatline, which means that we're probably getting as good as it's going to get. There's probably some room for improvement, but just becoming less. Because it's impossible to forecast a natural system perfectly, so it'll never be a perfect forecast. But Intensity is a little more challenging, and especially the rapid intensification that we talked about previously. That's a huge part of the issues with this. Is it's hard to know when to trust forecasts of it. So, some of our hurricane models do fine with forecasting rapid intensification, but they get it off by 12 hours or 24 hours, and or they'll do it far too often, and it's like, well, okay, is it actually going to happen one of these times? So that continues to be a big problem to solve in the hurricane research world. Another aspect of it is just creating new hurricane models that are just more capable and more skillful, and that's an ongoing quest as well. And there are fairly big changes on their way to the hurricane model forecasting world, but they take a long time. It takes a long time to get these models up and running. You want to make sure that you're not doing more harm than good. If you can't beat just kind of using what we have now, then not great. But it's not that easy. So a lot of times this happened with our current best hurricane model. It was supposed to replace the previous one, but the previous one was running for like 10 years alongside with it because the new one just couldn't outpace it yet in a consistent way. And eventually it did, and they dropped the old one. But many years where they're running together because you don't yet have the confidence in your new model to get rid of your old one. So, I mentioned that there are great things up and coming in the hurricane model world, but it's going to be a slow shift to accept them, basically.
And is there anything particular that you're working on right now?
Yeah, I guess, one thing related exactly to that topic is looking at hurricane model wind speeds over land. As it turns out, we don't really ever pay attention to that. We just let a model run, and they do pretty well for winds over the ocean. But verifying model forecasts over land is, it's pretty important, because if that's actually where we care what the winds are, a lot more so. Unless you're doing a storm surge model, but for people who live on land, it's models really have not had a lot of attention paid to how the surface winds do. The model just runs and they produce output, and that's that. But turns out it's not always great.
And of course, explain to folks, how the winds and the storm interact with land, and how that can impact what is being produced.
Yeah. So it really depends a lot on what type of land usage is going on, and what type, how moist your ground is matters even. It matters if you've got a city like Miami, which is a fairly abrupt, high roughness area immediately adjacent to the ocean. So you go from perfectly flat ocean to, bam, a wall of.
It's a mountain range.
It's a mountain range,
like of skyscrapers.
And that actually shows up in hurricane models, like a series of two papers that we had published this year looked at that, and it was for modeled winds over South Florida, and boy, you can really see those more rough patches really show up in the winds. And then so in the wake of that, the winds are weaker too. So it makes a big difference.
Interesting.
IDA should be a good study for that as well. We talked about how we have that long stretch over the flat marsh areas.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, let's wrap up here with giving you some more promotion. We're referencing your blog, succinctly named the Tropical Atlantic Update. How did it get started? Where can everyone find it? And you're not just involved with your blog. Brian has written for a number of well-known publications. So Tell us a little bit more about where we can read more about what Brian McNoldy thinks.
Sure. So the blog lives at bmcnoldy.blogspot.com. It started, I guess, before the word blog was invented, in 1996. That's what I've come to call it now, but at the time I didn't. And it really started out as just a few interested people that I knew, friends, family, of course, but people who I knew in different cities that actually were impacted by tropical cyclones. And back in the mid '90s, it was a little bit more of a challenge to actually come by information in a succinct amount of time and to compile everything. And so that's actually right from the start. The way I wrote it was to be accessible to just the average person who lives on a coastline, let's say, and doesn't want to have to go poking around for 45 minutes looking for this and this and this. So it's kind of a one-stop shop. You read your update for the day. You can then say, okay, who cares? There's nothing going on around me. Or you get the heads up like, oh, okay, something might be coming. I'll keep reading the next day. So it was always just an activity-based post. If nothing's happening, you don't hear from me. And when you do start hearing from me, then people start reading and like, oh, I hope it's not me. But yeah, so it really grew over the years. And I would say, well, I guess no huge shocker, but the 2004-2005 hurricane seasons were when it really blew up.
Mm-hmm.
Put it on the map. Well,
Yeah.
look, it's been great to talk with you today, Brian. It's been great to see you again. And I know you're doing
Likewise.
great work in South Florida at the University of Miami. And, hopefully we won't do a podcast with you next year because we won't have anything to talk about.
Well, we can still talk to him. We
We
can
can
talk
still
about,
talk.
you said
That's
when
true.
nothing happens. That's interesting. Come on.
Yeah.
That's true. That's true. I'm going against my own. Right. It's 2013 is the famous season, right? That no one
Yeah.
has been able to figure out, where just that forecast completely fell apart. And I know some of our best hurricane researchers still aren't sure why that was the case. Well, again, thanks for being on the podcast, and we look
Thank
forward
you.
to seeing you next time.
All right. Sounds good, Dave. Thanks.
Well, what can we say? It's been another devastating hurricane season for Louisiana, and for that matter, the Northeast United States, because of Ida, and they were hit by a couple of storms, I think as we alluded to as well, that also caused flooding. There was also the flooding from Claudette, of course, that we talked about. And Ida, though, clearly was the headline this year.
Yeah, that's right. We're all going to remember Ida. It's going to have that place, but 2 years in a row where we've used all of the names. We still discussed with Brian, though, it's not so much about all those numbers, but a lot about the ace and that energy that these storms bring along with it. So, I think this really puts out the statement. Remember, we always say it only takes one, and that's exactly how it shows up. Sometimes the big storms stay out over the water, but you never know what's going to make that impact on the place where you are.
And eventually the law of averages catch up with us. That's what we've learned, right? We had Isaac in 2012, and then literally went 8 years with nothing happening. And now we've had back-to-back landfalls in southeast Louisiana, both major hurricanes. Remember, Zeta was upgraded to a 3 when it made landfall in Terrebonne Parish. Didn't have the same impacts, obviously, as Ida did, but nevertheless, it was a significant storm with a significant impact. We continue to be Nicondra in the modern era, the modern active period in the Atlantic that goes back to the mid-90s. And incredibly, we've had 6 seasons in a row, as we mentioned, with above normal activity. The question remains, how long is this going to last? And typically, these active eras have been 25 to 40 years. It looks like we're just on the other side of 25, so there may be a little bit more to come.
Yeah, we're going to be watching this closely, and I tell you, it also kind of underscores the idea that we're still learning about this constantly. The more information we get this year, I think, we talked about having some additional information and data. That's also going to be a real key in us understanding more about how these storms are going to continue to form and affect us.
And I think Brian was talking about that with the research they're doing at the University of Miami. I mean, the number of storms we've had just in the last 5 years and in the Gulf of Mexico, and the number of super intense storms, rapidly intensifying storms like the Harveys, the Michaels, Lauras, and now the Idas. I think that's going to go a long way toward bringing in some data for research, especially on intensity forecasting, which we always talk about as being our weak point at the current time. Well, that's it for this episode of the David Bernard Podcast, and that's it for the 2021 hurricane season. That is a big, good riddance. For Nicondra Norwood, I'm David Bernard. Thanks for listening and watching. A reminder that you can watch this podcast. If you're listening to it, you can watch it on the Fox 8 website, fox8live.com/David. And if you're watching it on the Fox 8 website and you want to listen in your car, the podcast is available wherever you get your podcast. Have a great week. Stay safe, and we'll see you here next time.